By the early 1950s, Joseph Stalin, the dictator who once terrified an empire, was himself terrified of everyone around him. His health was failing, his mind was slipping, and his paranoia had swallowed whatever humanity he had left. Stalin's body shook from a series of minor strokes, his memory faltered, and he trusted no one. He began to suspect that even his doctors were plotting against him. When several physicians tried to warn him about his declining health, he had them arrested and accused them of conspiring to poison Soviet leaders. This became known as the Doctor's Plot, a final wave of terror that shocked even his closest allies. Nights at Stalin's dacha house outside Moscow became grim rituals. He stayed up until dawn, drinking and watching old movies, while his exhausted aides pretended to enjoy themselves. No one dared to leave or fall asleep. Any sign of boredom might look like disloyalty. By 1953, he was almost completely isolated. He no longer trusted the generals who had helped him win the war, or the ministers who ran his government. He had bugged their homes, monitored their families, and kept secret files on everyone, convinced that betrayal was imminent. In March of that year, Stalin suffered a massive stroke while alone in his quarters. His guards found him hours later, lying on the floor, barely conscious, but they hesitated to enter. No one wanted to risk his wrath if he woke up. For nearly a full day, the ruler of the Soviet Union lay there, half paralyzed and dying, surrounded by men too afraid to save him. When he finally passed on March 5, 1953, Stalin left behind an empire built on suspicion and a legacy of fear. His final days revealed what power had done to him. A man so consumed by paranoia that he couldn't distinguish loyalty from treachery or friend from enemy. Muammar Gaddafi used to speak for hours from golden podiums, calling himself the savior of Africa, but in his final year, he was speaking mostly to himself. Inside his compound in Tripoli, aides said he paced the marble halls at night, ranting about Western plots, unseen enemies, and the ingratitude of his people. When protests turned into revolution, he refused to believe it was real. He said the demonstrators were under the influence of substances and brainwashed or manipulated by foreign agents and Al-Qaeda. To him, every sign of rebellion was proof that the world had lost its mind, not him. His speeches became increasingly unhinged. On television, he wagged his finger at the camera, screaming that he was beloved by all Libyans and that the country would crumble without him. He called himself a prophet, a martyr, and the last true revolutionary. He even warned that the protesters' children would curse their fathers for betraying him. The more chaos surrounded him, the grander his claims became. He traveled nowhere without his female guards. He insisted on sleeping in a tent, even when visiting foreign heads of state, claiming it kept him closer to the desert spirits that guided him. He lectured international diplomats for hours, quoting his green book as if it were sacred scripture. His staff learned to applaud no matter what he said, because disagreement could mean exile or worse. As NATO airstrikes closed in, Gaddafi started phoning world leaders in the middle of the night, begging one moment and threatening the next. He recorded rambling audio messages from hiding, insisting Libya was at peace, even as explosions echoed behind him. When his convoy was finally surrounded near Sirte, he still believed he was untouchable. Witnesses said that he was shouting about divine protection as rebels dragged him from the wreckage. Gaddafi's end was the final act of a man who had long stopped living in the same reality as everyone else, trapped inside a story only he believed. In the final months of World War II, Adolf Hitler's mental state was deteriorating sharply. His physical health was collapsing. He had tremors in his left hand and slurred speech, likely from Parkinson's disease. But his psychological decline was even more severe. By early 1945, he was isolated underground in the Führer bunker in Berlin, surrounded by loyalists who feared contradicting him. He stopped trusting his generals, accused them of betrayal whenever battles were lost, and routinely dismissed or executed officers who brought bad news. He began issuing military orders completely detached from reality. Hitler commanded non-existent armies to launch counteroffensives and insisted the Soviets could still be defeated, even as they surrounded Berlin. He refused to evacuate civilians or allow retreats, claiming the German people had failed him and deserved ruin if they could not win. This scorched earth mindset culminated in the Nero Decree, March 1945, ordering Germany's own infrastructure destroyed to prevent its use by the Allies. He also displayed clear paranoia, convinced that secret plots and traitors were undermining him. He trusted only a shrinking inner circle, Goebbels, Bormann, and Eva Braun, and dismissed all intelligence that contradicted his fantasies. His daily life fell into chaos, erratic sleep, endless rants, and obsessive micromanagement of troops that no longer existed. Witnesses described him as pale, trembling, muttering to himself, and prone to sudden outbursts of rage and tears. He became fixated on loyalty tests and revenge fantasies. He blamed everyone but himself, the army, the German people, even the weather, for the collapse. He shouted about cowardice and treachery, saying that if Germany couldn't win, it didn't deserve to survive. Those who saw him said he looked ghostly, mumbling to himself one moment, sitting in eerie silence the next. By April 1945, Hitler was living in a world of delusion. He still believed in miracle weapons that would reverse the war, and that the Allies might suddenly turn against the Soviets. When the truth finally became undeniable, Berlin surrounded, his forces destroyed, he sank into despair and self-pity. In the final days, he tested cyanide capsules on his dog, Blondie, to ensure they worked. They did, and Blondie was no longer. With Soviet troops closing in, rather than face capture, Hitler took matters into his own hands. He bit into a cyanide capsule, then put a pistol to his head and ended it. At first, Idi Amin called himself the last king of Scotland. By the end, he believed it. In the 1970s, Amin ruled Uganda through terror mixed with theater. He loved attention, calling himself titles like the Conqueror of the British Empire and the Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea. But as his rule dragged on, those jokes became obsessions. He surrounded himself with astrologers and witch doctors, convinced they could protect him from curses. Ministers disappeared overnight. He'd announce military victories that never happened, then celebrate them with parades. His paranoia grew worse with every year. He demanded absolute loyalty, executing friends and allies for imagined betrayal. He claimed foreign powers were plotting to end his life, and changed bodyguards constantly. Witnesses said he talked to himself, laughing at nothing, and would burst into fits of rage over rumors. He kept severed heads in freezers as proof of triumphs. By 1979, as Tanzanian forces invaded Uganda, Amin had lost all grip on reality. He still appeared on radio declaring total victory, even while the capital was falling. He ordered non-existent divisions to attack, then disappeared when no one obeyed. Exiled to Saudi Arabia, he spent his last years insisting he was still president of Uganda. He lived in silence, surrounded by guards, often staring out windows and claiming that one day his people would beg him to return. By the end, Idi Amin was trapped inside his own fantasy world, a self-made king, ruling over a kingdom that existed only in his mind. Power completely consumed Jean-Bédel Bokassa. By the late 1970s, the former army officer who once styled himself a reformer had turned his Central African Republic into a stage for his own delusions. He wasn't satisfied with being president. He wanted to be emperor. In late 1977, Bokassa held a coronation unlike anything Africa had ever seen. He rode through Bangui in a gold-trimmed carriage, wore a velvet cape that stretched the length of a cathedral aisle, and crowned himself with diamonds while his subjects starved. The ceremony cost tens of millions of dollars, around a third of the nation's annual budget, and it marked the moment he began to lose all touch with reality. After declaring himself Emperor Bokassa I, he ruled like a man trapped in a fantasy. He forced school children to wear uniforms with his portrait printed on them. He designed medals for himself, spoke of divine missions, and demanded to be addressed as His Majesty. Ministers were terrified to speak honestly. He trusted only flattery and believed that foreign powers were plotting to overthrow him. His moods were unpredictable. One day he'd hand out cash in the streets, and the next he'd order brutal punishments for imagined disloyalty. He switched religions several times, Catholic, Muslim, and then Catholic again, claiming dreams and angels guided his choices. Visitors described him as pacing his palace late at night, talking to himself or shouting at aides who weren't there. In 1979, the tipping point came when students protested against the expensive mandatory uniforms bearing his face. Bokassa's response was vicious. Reports emerged that he had personally participated in the harsh treatment that followed. The outrage gave France, his one-time patron, an excuse to act. While Bokassa was on a trip abroad, French forces launched Operation Barracuda and ended his reign. Even in exile, Bokassa insisted he was still emperor. He told interviewers that France had betrayed the empire and that history would prove him right. In his final years, he wandered his state in military uniform, decorated with medals for a country that no longer existed, still addressing himself in the imperial we. By the end, Jean-Bédel Bokassa was living entirely inside his own myth, cut off from reality, surrounded by ghosts of the glory he invented. At first, Francisco Macías Nguema looked like a liberator. In 1968, he became the first president of Equatorial Guinea after independence from Spain. Within a few years, people stopped seeing him as a leader and started whispering that he had gone mad. He began sleeping during the day and holding government meetings at midnight. He banned reading, saying books made people confused. He ordered the death of teachers, doctors, and anyone with an education. Even saying the word intellectual could get you arrested. He closed schools, burned libraries, and emptied hospitals. By the mid-1970s, the country had lost a third of its population to exile, execution, or starvation. Macías spent his days smoking cannabis, using hallucinogens, and ranting about invisible enemies. Ministers who entered his office never knew what mood he'd be in. Some left with promotions, others never returned. He claimed to hear voices and began calling himself the unique miracle, the immortal, and eventually God. In state radio broadcasts, citizens were ordered to praise him like a deity. He no longer trusted the capital, so he moved the government to his remote hometown of Nguema, deep in the jungle. There he hoarded the nation's cash inside a hut guarded by soldiers and ruled through random orders shouted from his porch. He executed his only relatives, including close relatives like his own brother, accusing them of sorcery. By 1979, the country was collapsing. No schools, no electricity, no medicine. When his nephew, Teodoro Obiang, led a coup, Macías fled into the forest with sacks of money and a few loyal guards. When captured, he still insisted he could not die because he was the sun that gives life. Despite this claim, he was executed later that year. Toward the end of his life, Ivan IV of Russia, known as Ivan the Terrible, wasn't ruling an empire so much as terrorizing it. Once an intelligent reformer and military leader, he descended into unpredictable rages, religious obsession, and crippling paranoia. In his later years, Ivan became convinced that everyone around him was plotting treason. He ordered the creation of the Oprichnina, a private army that wore black robes and hunted supposed enemies across Russia. Entire towns were wiped out on his suspicion alone. Even close advisors feared to speak in his presence, as he alternated between wild laughter and violent outbursts. He began spending long hours in prayer, fixated on sin and punishment. Some accounts describe him striking his own head during church services and confessing obsessively to sins and past violence, only to erupt moments later in fits of anger. Historians believe chronic illness, possibly mercury poisoning from medical treatments, drove his mental decline. The breaking point came in 1581. During an argument with his son and heir, Ivan struck him in the head with his staff, fatally wounding him. Witnesses said he collapsed over the body, sobbing uncontrollably, calling out his son's name. After that, Ivan was never the same. In his final years, he surrounded himself with astrologers and holy men, terrified of death yet obsessed with it. He frequently donned monastic robes and sought chemical remedies meant to extend his life. When he finally passed away in 1584, while playing chess, servants found his body dressed in ceremonial robes, as if he'd been preparing for his own funeral. Pol Pot once promised to create a pure, self-reliant nation, but by the end, he was hiding in the jungle. As leader of the Khmer Rouge, he emptied Cambodia's cities, abolished money, and forced millions into labor camps. But after being driven from power in 1979, Pol Pot refused to believe his regime had collapsed. He told his followers that Vietnam had invaded only temporarily, and that he would soon return in triumph. Over the next 2 decades, his mind decayed under the weight of fear and denial. He moved constantly through the jungle, surrounded by armed guards and a shrinking circle of loyalists. He trusted no one. Senior commanders were arrested or executed for betrayal. Even his oldest allies, men who had fought beside him for decades, were accused of being spies. Witnesses describe him as frail, withdrawn, and increasingly erratic. He would sit for hours in silence, then erupt in anger about imaginary conspiracies. He denied responsibility for the deaths of millions, insisting the violence had been carried out by others. To the few who still listened, he claimed he had saved Cambodia from foreign control and that history would vindicate him. By 1997, his own movement had turned on him. He was tried by his former comrades in a mock tribunal and placed under house arrest. A journalist who saw him in late 1997 described a frail, nearly blind figure, shuffling through a wooden hut, still calling himself the rightful leader of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot's life ended in 1998, isolated, unrepentant, and delusional to the end, insisting that everything he'd done had been for the good of his country, even as the world remembered him as one of history's greatest monsters. For nearly 25 years, Nicolae Ceaușescu ruled Romania like a man convinced he could reshape reality through willpower alone. He filled every building with portraits of himself, built a palace the size of a city, and demanded citizens thank him for shortages he had created. His speeches were rehearsed performances of control, and nobody dared tell him that the country was starving. By December 1989, the illusion was cracking. Protests erupted in Timisoara, but Ceaușescu refused to believe it. He called the demonstrators hooligans, foreign agents, and traitors. When reports came that the unrest was spreading, he dismissed them all as rumors. To prove the nation still adored him, he ordered a massive rally in Bucharest, televised live for the entire country. As he stepped onto the balcony and began his speech, the crowd turned. Boos and shouts cut through the silence. Ceaușescu froze mid-sentence, his hands still raised in the air. For a few seconds he looked lost. confused, blinking, unable to process what he was seeing. The cameras kept rolling as his wife, Elena, grabbed his arm, trying to steady him. By December 22nd, as protests escalated, much of the army joined the rebellion. Ceaușescu refused to surrender, shouting orders to soldiers who no longer listened. He insisted the chaos was caused by terrorists and Western plots, even as his own regime disintegrated around him. When mobs stormed the presidential building, he and Elena escaped by helicopter, flying aimlessly across the countryside before being captured. In custody, he acted as if nothing had changed. He demanded to see his parliament, declared himself still president, and accused the officers around him of treason. During his short military trial, he shouted over the judges, denied every charge, and recited slogans from memory like a broken machine. On December 25, 1989, the sentence was carried out. Moments before the firing squad opened fire, Ceaușescu was still shouting political slogans, still insisting the people loved him. The man who had once commanded absolute obedience died in disbelief, trapped in a fantasy of his own making. Benito Mussolini used to stride onto balconies with the roar of adoring crowds, calling himself the heir to Caesar. But by the final months of the war, he was slumped in a chair, staring at maps that no longer mattered. His empire was gone, his allies were gone, and the man who once terrified Europe now barely recognized himself. After Italy's army collapsed and the fascist council turned against him in 1943, Mussolini was arrested on orders from the king. The shock broke something in him. When German commandos rescued him and set him up as the puppet ruler of a republic in northern Italy, witnesses said he looked hollow, his energy gone, his speeches flat, his eyes unfocused. He spoke often of betrayal and destiny, but rarely made sense. He spent long hours isolated at his headquarters on Lake Garda, pacing or sitting in silence while others spoke. Reports describe him as alternating between rage and despair, one day promising vengeance and the next admitting it was all lost. He blamed everyone but himself, the generals, the king, even the Italian people, whom he called weak and unworthy of his vision. By April 1945, Mussolini's behavior had turned fatalistic. As German defenses crumbled, he refused to surrender, but made no plans to fight. He wandered between meetings in a daze, muttered about vindication and history's judgment. When it became clear that the Allies and the Italian partisans were closing in, he tried to flee north toward Switzerland with his mistress, Clara Pettasilli, disguised in a German uniform. They didn't make it far. On April 27th, partisans stopped the convoy near the village of Dongo. The next day, both were executed, and their bodies displayed publicly in Milan. Mussolini, once the swaggering father of fascism, died as a fugitive, paranoid, defeated, and delusional to the very end. It's crazy how crazy these dictators went, and we see a common pattern here. Paranoia, extreme narcissism, and almost an addiction to their own delusion. But what do you think? Which of these was the most delusional? Who went the most psycho in the end? And who did we miss? Are there any other world leaders you think should be added to the Gone Psycho list? I'd love to hear your thoughts below. And if you're still around, please like the video and subscribe to the channel to get notified about more videos like this we come out with in the future. Thanks for watching. See you next time.